On the night of February 17, 1864, 8 men sealed themselves inside a 40-foot iron tube beneath Charleston Harbor and hand-cranked their way toward history. They never came back. For 131 years, the H.L. Hunley rested in 30 feet of water, less than a football field from shore, while search teams combed the wrong coordinates, and the ocean kept it secret. When divers finally pulled back the silt in 1995, they found the crew still at their stations, skeletons frozen mid-crank, no signs of struggle, no attempt to escape. So if they didn't panic, what killed them? By 1863, the Union blockade had strangled Charleston's ports so tight that cotton sat rotting on docks and families were grinding acorns for coffee. The city that had fired the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter was now choking on its own defiance. Confederate engineers, working in a mobile Alabama boiler shop with scrap iron and zero margin for error, welded together a hand-powered submarine using a steam boiler as the hull. The concept was simple enough on paper. Seal men inside an iron cylinder, give them a hand crank connected to a propeller, attach a torpedo to a long pole on the bow, and send them out to ram Union ships in the dark. It had already sunk twice during trials, drowning 13 men total. The first sinking happened on August 29, 1863, in Charleston Harbor, shortly after the submarine arrived from Mobile. The captain dove at too steep an angle. Water poured through the open hatches faster than the crew could react, and 5 men drowned in minutes. They raised it, drained it, and kept testing. The second sinking was worse. It happened on October 15, 1863. At Pierside in Charleston Harbor, in front of investors and Confederate Navy officials. Horace Lawson Hunley himself, the wealthy New Orleans lawyer who'd funded the entire project, was demonstrating a crash dive to prove the submarine could submerge and surface on command. Something went wrong with the hatches or the ballast system, the reports conflict. Water poured in faster than the hand pumps could clear it. The submarine went down bow first in less than a minute. When they raised it weeks later using chains and a floating crane, they found all 8 crew members dead inside, including Hunley near the aft section. The men had drowned trapped in the iron tube, unable to escape. The recovery was grim enough that witnesses refused to describe details in official reports. They hosed out the bodies. They plugged the leaks with tar and oakum. They remachined the hatch seals using rubber gaskets, cannibalized from a captured Union steam engine. And then they put out a call for a new crew. Lieutenant George Dixon volunteered within days. He was 24 years old, a mobile native, an engineer by training who'd been wounded twice in combat, and was technically on medical leave when he heard about the project. He carried a bent gold coin in his pocket, a $20 Liberty Double Eagle. His fiancée had given him before the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. During that battle, a Minié ball had hit him in the left thigh. It should have severed his femoral artery and bled him out in minutes. Instead, it struck the coin in his pocket first, flattening the round and deflecting it into muscle tissue instead of the artery. The coin was dented in the center, bent almost in half, but it had saved his life. He believed it would protect him again. He told people it was his lucky charm, that as long as he carried it, he couldn't be killed. Whether he actually believed that or just needed something to hold on to, we'll never know. But he found 7 other men who believed it too, or at least said they did. This wasn't innovation. It was a Hail Mary with a kill rate higher than combat. The Confederacy had no naval infrastructure, no funding, and no time to test what they were building. Every major naval power in the world had experimented with submersibles by this point and abandoned them as death traps. The French inventor Robert Fulton had tried selling a combat submarine to Napoleon in 1801. The French Navy rejected it as too dangerous to crew. The British Admiralty declared submersibles ungentlemanly weapons of terror in 1805, and banned development. The U.S. Navy itself had rejected multiple submarine proposals during the 1840s and 1850s, citing unacceptable risk to crews and no tactical advantage sufficient to justify inevitable losses. But Charleston was dying. The Union blockade wasn't just a military inconvenience, it was an economic execution. Ships sat in the harbor loaded with cotton bales worth millions of dollars in European markets, unable to pass the cordon of Union gunboats patrolling outside the harbor. Medicine couldn't get in. Ammunition couldn't get in. Food couldn't get in. By late 1863, bread cost $25 a loaf in Confederate currency, which was itself nearly worthless. Soldiers were deserting at rates that made combat losses look minor. Families were burning furniture to stay warm because firewood cost more than most people earned in a month. Hunley represented asymmetric warfare before the term existed, a weapon so dangerous to its own operators that survival was never part of the mission brief. It was a calculated trade, 8 men for 1 Union warship. In the brutal arithmetic of a losing war, that was a bargain the Confederacy was willing to make. When Dixon assembled his crew for the first time in early February 1864, he didn't lie to them. He walked them through what had happened in the previous sinkings. He explained that the submarine had no emergency escape system, no backup air supply, no way to signal for help if something went wrong. If they went down, they stayed down. Then he asked who still wanted to go. All 7 raised their hands. Arnold Becker, a German-born machinist who'd emigrated to Charleston before the war and enlisted when it started. James A. Wicks, a boat builder who understood how the crank system worked better than anyone. Joseph Ridgeway, a local harbor pilot who knew every sandbar and current in Charleston's coastal waters. Frank Collins, 19 years old, the youngest of the group, a machinist's apprentice. Corporal J. F. Carlson, a Confederate Marine. 2 others whose names survive only as question marks in the historical record. Men who volunteered knowing they might die anonymous. The fact that Dixon took command anyway, with a lucky charm and a crew of volunteers who knew the odds, tells you everything about how far gone Charleston was. They weren't trying to win the war. Everyone knew by February 1864 that the Confederacy was finished. Sherman was burning his way through Georgia. Grant was grinding Lee's army to dust in Virginia. The blockade had been unbroken for 3 years. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to prove the blockade could bleed, that the North couldn't just starve the South into submission without consequences, that 8 men in an iron coffin could hurt them. What they didn't know was that the weapon itself, the spar torpedo, jutting roughly 20 feet from the bow like a medieval lance, might kill them as surely as the enemy. At 8:45 p.m. on February 17, 1864, the Union sloop of war USS Housatonic exploded. Witnesses on shore Confederate soldiers manning artillery positions on Sullivan's Island, civilians watching from rooftops in Charleston 3 miles away, saw a flash of orange light low on the water, heard a low thud that rattled windows and shook the ground, and watched the 140-ton warship lurch violently to starboard and begin sinking. The entire event, from explosion to the ship settling on the bottom, took less than 5 minutes. 5 Union sailors died. It was the first time in history a submarine sank an enemy warship in combat. The Housatonic had been on routine blockade patrol, one of 7 Union vessels forming a semicircle around Charleston Harbor's entrance. Her engines were idling. Most of the 160-man crew were below decks finishing evening rations, salt pork, hardtack, coffee if they were lucky. The officer of the watch, acting Master John Crosby, was on the quarterdeck scanning the dark water with a spyglass, more out of boredom than vigilance. The blockade had been uncontested for so long that attack seemed like a theoretical problem. Around 8:40 p.m., Crosby saw something in the water about 100 yards off the starboard beam. It looked like a log, or maybe a porpoise surfacing. He watched it for a few seconds. Then it moved against the current, not drifting, but moving with purpose, leaving a faint wake. He rang the alarm bell and shouted for the ship to reverse engines, but you don't turn a 207-foot sloop in 30 seconds. The engine room crew scrambled to reverse the boilers. Sailors poured onto the deck, some grabbing rifles and firing blindly at the shape in the water. By the time the ship started moving backward, it was too late. The Hunley's spar torpedo, a long iron rod with a copper-cased explosive charge containing 135 pounds of black powder attached to the tip, made contact with the Housatonic's starboard side just below the waterline, near the ship's powder magazine. Lieutenant Dixon, crouched inside the Hunley's forward conning tower, pulled the lanyard trigger. The torpedo detonated. The explosion tore a massive hole through the wooden hull. The Housatonic lurched forward, her masts snapping at sharp angles, rigging collapsing into the water. She began taking on water at a rate that made lifeboats pointless. Most of the crew survived by sheer luck. The water was so shallow, only 18 feet deep, that when the ship settled on the bottom, her masts and rigging remained above the surface. Men climbed into the rigging and stood there, waist deep in water, waiting for rescue boats from nearby Union ships. But 5 men in the lower decks never made it out. The explosion had either killed them instantly or trapped them below the waterline as the compartments flooded. The ship settled upright on the sandy bottom and stayed there, masts jutting up like grave markers visible for miles. Within an hour, Union rescue boats had pulled the survivors off the wreck. By morning, divers were already surveying the damage and recovering bodies. Confederate lookouts waiting on Sullivan's Island, 3/4 of a mile northwest across the harbor, reported seeing a blue lantern signal from the water shortly after the explosion. It was part of the mission plan Hunley was supposed to surface after the attack. Signal success. With a blue-filtered lantern visible from shore, then return to the beach where a recovery team would be waiting to help maneuver the submarine back to its dock. The lookouts saw the light blink, then go dark. They waited for the submarine to return. Then they waited longer. By 10 p.m., officers on the island were scanning the water with spyglasses, looking for any sign of the Hunley, debris, an oil slick, bodies, wreckage, anything. The harbor was calm. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see 100 yards in any direction. Visibility was perfect. There was nothing. No distress calls, no debris field, no shape moving in the water. The Hunley had just vanished. Search parties launched boats at first light and dragged the harbor for weeks using grappling hooks and weighted nets. They found broken crates, tangled fishing line, a Union sailor's boot, part of a ship's railing, but no submarine. By March, the Confederate Navy officially declared the crew lost with honors and stopped active searching. By April, Union forces were shelling Charleston from land positions, and nobody had time to keep looking for a ghost. Here's where the accepted story starts to fall apart. For over a century, historians assumed the crew drowned. The prevailing theory was that the torpedo's blast ruptured the Hunley's hull, or that the shockwave disoriented the crew, and they couldn't find the ballast controls in time to surface, or that the hand crank mechanism jammed and they suffocated while waiting for help that never came. Some speculated the submarine had been swept out to sea by currents and lost in deep water. Others thought it had been buried so deep in harbor silt that it would never be found. Navy divers searched the area sporadically through the 1870s and 1880s, partly to recover the Housatonic, partly to see if the Confederate submarine could be salvaged and studied. They found nothing. By 1900, most maritime historians assumed the Hunley was gone forever, either corroded to unrecognizable scrap or lost miles offshore in water, too deep to search with 19th century equipment. But when the wreck was finally located in 1995, a few hundred feet from the Housatonic, slightly seaward in a line away from shore and raised in 2000, and conservators carefully opened the hatches using pneumatic tools and fiber optic cameras, there was no catastrophic hull damage. No rupture from the explosion. No cracks in the iron plating. The seams were intact. The ballast tank showed no signs of emergency flooding. The bilge pumps hadn't been engaged. The handles were still in the resting position, undisturbed. The hand crank was positioned as if the crew had been operating the submarine when they stopped. The diving plane's horizontal rudders used to control depth were angled in a way consistent with level running. The snorkel tubes, primitive air intake pipes that allowed the crew to breathe while submerged at shallow depth, were extended and clear of obstructions. And every single man was still seated at his station, hands near the crank, bodies positioned as if they'd been in the middle of their work. No one near the hatches trying to escape. No tools scattered from a frantic repair attempt. No evidence of panic, movement, or struggle. They were sitting there as if they'd simply stopped. If the hull didn't flood and they didn't try to escape, what made 8 experienced submariners, men who knew every emergency protocol, who'd trained for weeks in how to surface the boat, all die in their positions without any attempt to save themselves? Forensic teams found Lieutenant George Dixon's skeleton near the forward conning tower, still in position at his station. The bent gold coin, the $20 Liberty Double Eagle his fiancée had given him. The one that had saved his life at Shiloh was still where his trouser pocket would have been. The fabric had rotted away completely, leaving only metal artifacts, but the coin sat in the sediment next to brass uniform buttons, a corroded iron belt buckle, and a pocket watch stopped at 8:23. The watch is important. It's a key wound brass pocket watch, standard officer issue, with Dixon's initials engraved on the inside case. The hands are frozen at 8:23 in the morning, not the evening of the attack. Either the watch had stopped earlier that day and Dixon hadn't wound it, or something about the conditions or the blast affected it in ways researchers still don't fully understand. The other 7 men were positioned along the hand crank shaft. Arnold Becker, the German-born machinist, was at the first station nearest the bow. James Wicks was at the second position. Joseph Ridgeway was third. Frank Collins, the 19-year-old apprentice, was stationed mid-shaft. Their bodies were positioned as if they'd been operating the crank, some with hands near the handles, others in positions suggesting they'd just been working. No fractures, no signs of blunt trauma. No indication anyone had been thrown against the walls or ceiling by a violent impact. When forensic pathologists examined the remains under controlled laboratory conditions, working with the skeletal material still partially embedded in hardened sediment to preserve context, they found the crew positioned calmly at their stations. There was no evidence of the kind of struggle you'd expect from drowning or panic. The mystery deepened. In the bow section, remnants of the spar torpedo's copper casing were recovered, bent and fragmented, but still identifiable. Chemical analysis of residue found on the metal confirmed black powder explosive potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur in ratios consistent with Civil War-era munitions. The spar itself was bent near the attachment point, consistent with impact and detonation. The trigger mechanism, a simple lanyard system that Dixon would have pulled from inside the conning tower to detonate the charge, showed evidence of having been activated. Engineers at Duke University, working with naval historians and explosives experts, ran a series of blast simulations in 2017. They built models and ran calculations to understand what happens when a large black powder charge detonates near an iron hull in shallow water. They discovered something no one had considered in 150 years of theorizing. A 135-pound black powder charge detonated close to an iron hull in shallow water creates a pressure wave that can pass through metal without breaching it. Here's the physics. Sound travels at roughly 100 feet per second in air. In water, it travels at nearly 5,000 feet per second. An underwater explosion generates a shock wave, a wall of compressed water molecules moving faster than the speed of sound in air, that radiates outward in all directions. When that wave hits a solid object like an iron hull, it doesn't necessarily stop. The wave can transfer through the metal and release on the other side as a pulse of overpressure. Inside the Hunley, that pressure wave could have struck the crew's bodies in devastating ways. The human body is mostly water, which means it conducts shock waves efficiently. But we have air pockets, lungs, sinuses, the inner ear, the gastrointestinal tract. When a shock wave passes through tissue and encounters an air-filled cavity, it creates a pressure differential that can cause massive internal trauma. The brain could compress against the skull. The lungs could collapse and rupture. The heart could stop as the shock wave disrupted its rhythm. The inner ear structures could shatter. All of it could happen faster than the nervous system could register pain. They could have been dead before their conscious minds understood what had happened. This changes the entire narrative. Hunley didn't fail. It didn't malfunction. There was no tactical error, no crew mistake, no mechanical breakdown. Lieutenant George Dixon did everything exactly right. He approached the Housatonic submerged to avoid detection. He navigated using the forward viewport and compass bearings provided by Joseph Ridgeway, the harbor pilot who knew the waters. He positioned the spar torpedo against the enemy hull near the powder magazine to maximize damage. He triggered the detonation at the optimal moment. He destroyed a Union warship in under 5 minutes, the first successful submarine attack in military history. The mission was a success by every measure, but no one had tested what happens to a crew sealed inside an iron tube when a massive explosive detonates in close proximity underwater. They didn't have the physics. They didn't have the mathematical models. They didn't have pressure sensors or blast wave analysis or any understanding of hydrostatic shock. They had a weapon that worked in theory, designed by engineers who understood mechanics and chemistry, but not the full picture of underwater blast dynamics, and a war that didn't give them time to find out if the theory killed its own operators. The blue signal lantern found in the forward section of the submarine, still intact with its glass shade, raises questions that remain unanswered. Confederate lookouts reported seeing a blue light signal after the attack, but the lantern was found inside the sealed submarine. How the signal was seen, whether it was actually lit after the blast, and what it means for understanding the crew's final moments, none of it adds up cleanly. There's another detail. When the Hunley was found, it was positioned away from the Housatonic, several hundred feet seaward. The crank and diving planes were in positions consistent with operation. Everything about the configuration suggests the submarine had been under control when it stopped. If the blast killed the crew instantly, how did the submarine end up where it was found? Ocean currents could have moved it. Residual momentum from the crew's final crank strokes could have carried it forward. Post-mortem effects could have locked hands in position, but the clean positioning, the lack of chaos inside, the organized scene, it all suggests something more controlled than drift. Either some of the crew survived the initial blast long enough to try reaching shore before succumbing to injuries they couldn't see, or the physics of current and momentum created a perfect illusion of intentional movement. The evidence doesn't definitively prove either scenario. In 1995, when novelist Clive Cussler's marine archaeology team located the wreck using magnetometer surveys in a grid search pattern outside Charleston Harbor, descendants of the crew were still alive. One of them was a man named Frank Collins, same name as the 19-year-old machinist's apprentice who'd operated the mid-shaft crank position. This Frank Collins was the great-great-grandson, a retired machinist who'd grown up in Charleston hearing family stories about an ancestor who disappeared at sea during the Civil War, with no grave, no ceremony, no official confirmation of death. Just a name on a monument in Magnolia Cemetery, and a family legend about a submarine that might have been lost, or captured by Union forces, or never existed at all outside of Confederate wartime propaganda. For over a century, the Hunley existed in a strange historical limbo, mentioned in a few Confederate naval reports, referenced in Union accounts of the Housatonic sinking, but with no physical evidence. Some historians dismissed it as myth. Others believed it had existed, but was lost forever. When the wreck site was confirmed in 1995, after weeks of sonar surveys, and finally a diver putting hands on the iron hull in 30 feet of murky water, Frank Collins was among the first people the archaeologists contacted. They showed him sonar images of the wreck, 40 feet long, iron hull, lying intact in the silt, with the distinctive conning towers still visible. He broke down. They invited him to the site when the raising operation happened 5 years later, August 8, 2000. A Tuesday, brutally hot even by Charleston standards. Temperatures in the mid-90s, humidity thick enough to see. Over 20,000 people lined the shores of Charleston Harbor, crowding on to docks, boats, rooftops, anywhere with a view of the water. The recovery barge, a massive floating platform with a crane rated for 150 tons, had been positioned over the wreck site for days. Engineers had spent weeks designing a custom lifting cradle, a steel frame padded with foam and neoprene to distribute weight evenly and prevent the fragile hull from collapsing under its own weight after 136 years underwater. The lift took 9 hours. Divers worked in shifts, guiding the cradle straps under the submarine's hull while trying not to disturb the sediment or damage corroded metal that had thinned in places to paper-thin sheets. When the Hunley finally broke the surface for the first time since 1864, covered in barnacles and black mud, streaming water from every seam, the crowd went silent. No cheering, no applause, no celebration. Just silence, heavy and respectful, like watching a funeral. Because that's what it was. The submarine wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a war grave containing the remains of 8 men who'd been missing for 131 years. The crew was given full military honors. It took 4 more years to properly excavate and identify the remains. Forensic archaeologists worked inside the sealed submarine using fiber optic cameras and precision tools, carefully removing sediment layer by layer to preserve context. DNA analysis was impossible for most of the crew. 19th century record keeping didn't include biological samples, and descendants were too genealogically distant for reliable matches. But they identified Lieutenant Dixon through the gold coin, cross-referenced with letters he'd written describing it. They identified others through uniform buttons, personal effects, positions in the crew, manifest match to skeletal positioning. On April 17, 2004, 140 years and 2 months after they vanished, the crew of the H.L. Hunley was buried at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston. Confederate and Union Civil War reenactment groups both attended, standing together in period uniforms on opposite sides of the graves. Active-duty U.S. Navy personnel served as pallbearers. Over 10,000 people filled the cemetery and lined the streets outside. The coffins were draped in Confederate naval flags. A period-accurate honor guard fired a 3-volley salute using reproduction rifles. But even then, the forensic cause of death remained uncertain. The burial records listed drowning because that was the prevailing theory, and no one wanted to delay the funeral for more analysis. The blast wave theory didn't gain wide attention until years later, when Duke University published its study. Even now, it remains one leading hypothesis among several. Some families still struggle with it. They want to believe their ancestors died fighting to return home, not that they were killed by a weapon they didn't fully understand. And maybe that's the harder truth, that 8 men climbed into a prototype with a fatal track record, in service of a war that was already lost and succeeded perfectly, only to die from physics no one had calculated, because there wasn't time for safety testing when the enemy was at the gates. The Hunley's legacy isn't just about submarine warfare. It's about what desperation makes people willing to risk. These men knew what they were signing up for. George Dixon didn't hide the previous deaths from them. They knew. And they went anyway, because their city was dying and someone had to try. The wreck site is now a war grave, legally protected under federal law. No one is allowed to dive it without authorization. The submarine itself sits in a custom conservation tank at the Warren Lash Conservation Center in North Charleston, a massive stainless steel tank filled with treatment solution that slowly stabilizes the corroding iron hull. The conservation process continues. Researchers estimate the hull will be stable enough for permanent display within the next few years. In the meantime, artifacts continue to emerge from the hardened sediment inside the crew compartment. In recent years, conservators have unveiled personal items, a canteen, pieces of clothing, small objects the crew carried with them into the dark. Each discovery adds another fragment to understanding who these men were. But many questions remain unanswered. The Blue Lantern, the Confederate lookouts, reported seeing no one has fully explained how they saw it if it was sealed inside the hull. The watch stopped at 8:23 in the morning instead of the evening. The organized positions of the crew showing no panic. The submarine's final location, suggesting movement after the attack. If the blast killed everyone in an instant, why does so much of the physical evidence suggest something more gradual? And if some of them survived long enough to try making it back, why is there no sign of distress or emergency action? The Hunley killed its crew the moment it succeeded. What happened in the minutes after the blast, while the submarine moved through dark water with men who may or may not have known they were already dying? That's a story the evidence still hasn't told.